Excellent. So we left off last time talking about the earliest operas, this flourishing in Florence, and this idea of looking back to ancient Greek rhetoric and ancient Greek drama as the model for what Baroque artistic standards should be. So that's the headspace we're in. But why all of this? What purpose does all of this grand spectacle serve? Well, a few. Firstly, edification. This was an appeal to feelings to improve ethics. And I'm going to hammer home that word ethics because remember at the beginning of the semester when we talked about Plato and Aristotle and Pythagoras and their modes in ancient Greece, we said that the whole purpose of those modes was to change the ethos of listeners. This is the exact same philosophy, that in the same way a Dorian mode could make you warlike, or in the same way that a Lydian mode could make you lazy and slothful, Baroque musicians are thinking along the same lines, that we can change people and make them better people by acting on their feelings through sound. So this is an appeal to feelings to improve personal ethics. And this all ties in to rhetoric, the art of using language to influence people. So musicians are again looking to language to figure out how to convince, how to persuade. And likewise, this is a symbol, this opera, this grand spectacle is a symbol of political power. Remember, opera started out as a courtly genre. This is paid for and hosted by really wealthy nobles. At their palaces, there are no opera halls yet. This is basically going on in rich people's living rooms, if you can call them living rooms when they get that big. So the operas were a way for these nobles to display wealth and power and social connection and class. Because not only were you showing off the money you had by paying for all of this spectacle, you were showing off how popular you were by inviting all of the other important people. And then those other important people would come and show off the fact that they were important enough to get an invitation. And you see, it's this cyclical signifier, for lack of a better word. Each opera, whether you're performing it or watching it, is a way to show your importance. And that includes even stage machinery, settings, the size of the orchestra. It ain't cheap to keep several musicians on staff. You also have to have dancers. You have to pay for the costumes. And this elaborate connected network of all of the stage pieces is where we get the phrase Deus ex machina from. Has anyone heard that phrase before? Yeah, Mark, what is a Deus ex machina?
So I don't know what its original meaning it really is exactly, but currently it's like a plot device in movies that is there solely for the purpose of saving the protagonists. Like it doesn't without much explanation.
Yes, that's, oh, good. And this is a literary trope too. And all of this comes from opera. All of this comes from this early stuff we're talking about now. And like Mark said, it's a way of saving the protagonist without much explanation. All of a sudden, there's a plot twist, and somebody powerful waves a magic wand, and everything has a happy ending. That's a Deus ex machina. Deus ex machina literally means God in a machine. So what would happen in these early operas is that gods, I mean, character, they weren't literal gods, but the characters of gods would come onto stage in machines because they're like floating down on a cloud, or they're racing in on a chariot, something. The God is coming in a machine, and all of a sudden snapping their fingers and making the plot go a certain way, as opposed to all logical ways the plot would go. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so an example of a Deus Ex Machina would be in this Orpheus piece that we're going to talk about today. And the original Orpheus myth ends with Eurydice being dragged back to the underworld because Orpheus looked back at her while he was trying to leave. So that's the original ending of the myth. But in the opera version, we get a Deus Ex Machina, a god in a machine. So Apollo comes down, takes such pity on Orpheus. He says, fine, you can't bear to live without Eurydice. I am going to turn you into a constellation in the sky so that your star, you as stars, can always look down on her. So the god in the machine comes, waves a magic wand, and comes up with a completely illogical solution that has nothing to do with any of the events that preceded it, and yet somehow gives everyone a happy ending. Now, does that make a little more sense? I feel like Dora the Explorer, you know, when she like looks out at the camera and asks the kids to shout something, but the kids never actually shout anything. Okay, I'm gonna take boots and keep going. So, yes, that is the purpose of, well, one of the purposes of early opera is to like show off your wealth and to put on as elaborate a spectacle as possible. So I wanted to touch on that before we hop in to today, and let us go to that. Okay, so continuing along this road, just a reminder of the texture that makes this possible, that good old-fashioned treble bass polarity. So we are separating the high and low sounds. We've got that high soloist, either a vocalist or an instrumentalist. And then we've got that basso continuo accompaniment. And this is in stark contrast to that very complex polyphony of the Renaissance. And because they're soloists, this allows them, allows the singers to act out parts individually rather than having a whole group sing about a story. And this gives rise to that thing that we talked about yesterday. Monody is the texture. Recitar cantando means to act through singing. And that's exactly what's going on in these monodies. Also a reminder, the basso continuo is largely improvised because, as you can see in the pictures here, the bass line doesn't have any chords around it. It's just got little tiny numbers over it. And so the person playing the basso continuo would have to fill in those numbers. They would have to fill in those intervals in a way they deemed appropriate. So I want to preview a piece that we're going to listen to in just a few days, but I want to get this piece in our ears to give you a sense of what monody and recitar cantando sound like. So here's Lagrime Mie by Barbara Strozzi. Oh, wait, I have to do it in the slideshow version. Come on, here we go. There's one else. Oh dear. Here. Okay, now see, I have a play button here. Why isn't that transfer? Ah, okay, let's do something. Aha, yes. Okay, here is Lagrimen. Okay, so we've got that sound in our ears. Did anybody hear the ribattuta di gola? Somebody explain to me what that ribattuta is. We talked a lot about it last time.
It's like the reattacking of the throat, and it was like whenever I said trill or in the TR.
Precisely. So we need to understand those Baroque trills are very different from trills as we understand them. Good. And that's that ribattuta, that reattacking the same note. Good. Okay. So treble bass polarity is the thing that's allowing all of this to happen. And let's look at the people who are leading the charge. Well, there is a very fun pamphlet war. And we've talked about pamphlet wars before. They're basically, again, just when people write angry open letters back and forth to each other in the form of treatises. So basically, these people would write treatises about what they thought music should be, and they would call out these people that they didn't like in them. So it would just be like an airing of beef, and that's a pamphlet war. And the pamphlet war surrounding the beginning of opera is a debate between Claudio Monteverdi and Giovanni Maria Artusi. So what Artusi does, he's a music theorist. He's not a composer, not a performer, he's a theorist. And he publishes a treatise on how modern music is destroying society. And he uses Claudio Monteverdi's monody as an example. So why is Artusi mad? What's he reacting against? Well, he's reacting against the idea of these modern dissonances operating on people to induce an unsavory ethos. Artusi believes all of this dissonance in modern music is causing people to be degenerate. It's causing the literal breakdown of society because people are hearing too many ugly notes. It sounds overly simplistic to us, but when they had such faith in the art of rhetoric, this makes total sense. If you believe music has the power to coerce its listeners to behave in certain ways, it makes 100% sense that you as a theorist would react so strongly in saying that ugly notes lead to the breakdown of society. So that's what's at stake here, according to Artusi, not just pretty sounds. According to Artusi, what's at stake is the entirety of civilization. On the other hand, we've got Claudio Monteverdi, and Monteverdi published more modern music in response to this treatise. And Monteverdi's brother, Giulio Cesare, writes a preface to this publication explaining why Artusi is wrong. So basically, the Monteverdi brothers are working in tandem. Claudio is the composer, and his brother, Giulio Cesare, is the wordsmith. And the Monteverdis say that Artusi is caught up in prima pratica, the first practice, or stile antico, which was fine for previous generations. That prima pratica was the rigid rules of counterpoint that we've been talking about so far this semester. That prima pratica was adding voice upon voice upon voice. That prima pratica was open fifths and octaves. That prima pratica was imitation. And Monteverdi says that's fine for previous generations, but I want to do something new. I want to do the seconda pratica or stile moderno. Those are synonymous terms. Seconda pratica, second practice, stile moderno, modern style. Those both mean the same thing. So what Monteverdi is doing with his stile moderno is shifting to expressivity. In other words, he's using sounds to express the emotion of the text. Dissonances are allowed, and they don't have to resolve in any particular way, as long as they help you feel the text. The purpose, or I should say this, the dissonances serve a very important purpose, according to the Monteverdis. That is, those dissonances are what make the text believable. So do we understand what the prima pratica is? Let's just start there. Does everybody understand what the prima pratica is?
I understand what you're saying. I just want to be clear that during this time he wanted to, as you just said, be more expressive within the music. So to put in those non-resolving factors and putting in the crunch in the music, for other words, to get across the fact that, I mean, if you're singing about death, it shouldn't sound happy.
Right.
Okay.
And when you say he, you mean Monteverdi, right?
Yes, sorry.
Okay, good. I just want to make sure we're on the same person. Good, good, good. Yeah, and just to nuance that a bit, it's not so much that the older polyphony always sounded happy, because there were ways to sound sad in the old polyphony, right? Like we heard those somber, soft sections in like Palestrina, for example. It's perhaps more about the composer's freedom to, like you said, leave those dissonances unresolved. So we could hear dissonances, and remember, William Byrd and John Dolan were full of dissonance. But with Monteverdi, the composer has the freedom to leave those dissonances unresolved or live in that dissonant world for a while. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that makes sense. So instead of, like I just said, instead of doing more of like the feeling more less happy, more sad, but more of a like you said, unresolved, to the fact of that's what more I was meaning of, like feeling unfinished, feeling upset at the end of a song, because it sounds good, but sometimes when you hear that kind of music and it does not resolve at the end, it kind of irritates me, but I get the reason behind it.
Yeah, well, and I mean, to be fair, yes. To be fair, if they would resolve at the cadence, like you wouldn't have a cadence, even in this Baroque seconda pratica. You wouldn't have a cadence anywhere other than a functional pitch, so like tonic dominant. These are the cadences we're used to. So the cadence would be a resolution. When I say resolve dissonances in terms of counterpoint, it's more about the horizontal line as it moves. So when we're talking about resolution in polyphony, it's not always the cadence. Resolution in polyphony in the prima pratica just meant a release of tension. So for example, if I had a dissonant note, then the next note had to be a consonance, and I had to approach it by step, and it had to occur on the strong beat. If I wanted to move from that to another dissonant note, it had to be on a weak beat. So that pattern of resolution is more what we're talking about with polyphony, or I should say counterpoint. Let me use the phrase counterpoint instead of polyphony. That type of resolution, horizontally speaking, is what we're looking at with counterpoint. Now, with this monody, with this stile moderno, what we're looking at is functional harmony. We're finally looking at chords. We're finally looking at tonic dominant. Does that make a little more sense too?
Yeah, that we're on the same page now.
Awesome. Yes. So does everybody feel good about what prima pratica is? Thumbs or hands? Okay, I see a few thumbs. Does everybody feel good about what seconda pratica is? Same thing, thumbs or hands. Come on, guys, don't let me be Dora the Explorer. Okay, close enough. So a lot of people feel good with prima pratica, seconda pratica, and we understand what's at stake with Monteverdi. So this argument erupts, and this pamphlet war ensues, where they keep going back and forth in their writing, arguing about all this new dissonance. And Monteverdi argues that dissonance serves expressivity, and he coins the phrase, let the text be mistress of the music. Everybody should walk out of this class at the end of the semester knowing that that is Monteverdi's credo. When you go out into the wide world of being a professional, and you have conversations about Monteverdi, and you will, you should know that his guiding philosophy is let the text be mistress of the music. So keep that in your head for use in the next several decades. And what Monteverdi means by that is, just like John said, if the text is like, say, about death or something sad or something unpleasant, painful, you don't want consonant happy music. You want something crunchy. You want something that makes you feel that pain. So that's exactly what they're arguing about. And Monteverdi, again, was part of this age of affect, when emotion is the modus operandi. Affect is the purpose of art as a whole. So when listening to this Baroque monody and opera, what you want to do is note which words the dissonances are on, because that tells us what the composer or characters really think and feel. Those dissonances are important information to listeners. Everybody feel good so far? Thumbs or hands? Good, good, good. I see several thumbs, so I feel good. Okay, let's talk about how these things are structured. Oh, I'm sorry, there was a pamphlet for it. Okay, let's talk about how these things are structured. And these early operas are comprised of two different types of singing. So the first part, the first type of singing you're going to hear going on in these operas is what we call recitativo, or in English, recitative. That's a word we still use today. For all the vocal students in here, you are already pros at recitative. You know what this is. Early recitativo was holding on to the same reciting tone. There's that word, reciting, recitar, cantando, recite through, acting through music. So this is all part and parcel of the same idea. You're holding on to the same reciting tone, that is a repeated pitch. It's unmetered music, so there's no steady beat. We're not in a time signature. You're just following the singer as the singer elocutes. And that is so that the recitative can reflect speech. Early audiences of opera would have heard recitativo as the part of the opera where characters are talking to each other instead of making music for other characters to hear. And this recitativo is where all the action occurs, because that's when characters talk to each other. The recitativo is the part of the opera that moves the plot forward. Events are taking place, information is conveyed. Textually, the type of poetry that goes along with recitativo is versi sciolti, free verse. So in other words, it's unrhymed. It does not have a regular meter, much like the music is unmetered, so is the poetry. And it sounds like conversation. Interestingly for us, the recitativo of early opera was considered the hard part. The recitativo is where singers were supposed to show off. That's where they got to display their virtuosity and skill. On the other hand, apart from recitativo, we have aria. Now, if recitativo is the speech-like part of opera, aria is the song-like part. This is where characters are actually singing songs and the other characters around them know it. So for example, in Orpheus, because Orpheus is the one we're talking about today, you've heard already, as you listen to your homework, you heard the scenes where the shepherds are singing and dancing with each other. That is aria, because that is a song that the characters would have experienced as song, as opposed to heightened recitation of poetry. Now, instead of conveying action like recitativo does, aria is very static. The action stops in an aria because the characters aren't advancing events. They're singing about their feelings. They're stopping, they're putting a pause button on the events so that they can stop and sing about emotion. Again, the age of affect. This makes sense in the age of affect. So this is what we call static instead of kinetic. Instead of versi sciolti, instead of the free verse, now we have versi lirici, structured poetry. So we have rhymes, we have strict meter. And the aria, again, weirdly for us in the 21st century, was considered the easy part. This is just a tune. This is a song that anybody should be able to sing, because we should all be able to frolic with shepherds and sing these lighthearted ditties. So these aria parts, in contrast to the recitativos, were melodic and metered. They're not sitting on one reciting tone anymore. They're actually singing a full melody. And just like the versi lirici are in strict linguistic meter, the aria is in strict musical meter. Does everybody feel good with the difference between recitativo and aria? Can I get thumbs or hands on that? Okay, good. I'm seeing many thumbs, and I'm assuming the ones that I don't see reactions for, I'm assuming you guys are out of the room because I don't see hands either. So let's go ahead and talk about what this looked like in practice. Now, the first operas were actually mostly recitative. Why? Because that's where all the acting takes place. Remember, they're basing these on the ancient Greek dramas. The point is to make it like a play, but recited. And so the recitative is the bulk of that. The recitative is them acting out the play to this heightened form of poetry. And moreover, bombarding your audience with songs right out of the gate would have been dramatically implausible. Think about this. You've never heard or seen an opera before. Opera doesn't exist yet. No such thing as acting to music exists. When all of a sudden you go to your friend's house for a new performance and people get up on stage singing to each other out of nowhere, what would your reaction be? And that's not a rhetorical question. I'm asking you, like, what if opera never existed and somebody did this to you for the first time, what would your reaction be?
It's kind of like, what is going on? It's like, why, it's like watching High School Musical when they just like spontaneously jump into song for no reason at all. And you're just like, this doesn't happen. Why is this the thing,
Wait a minute, you're telling me High School Musical is not based on real life? You're shattering my illusions here, Mark. But and as Rachel says, probably a bad word, absolutely. Alexis, yeah, what would your reaction be? And it's like a real, yes, exactly. Disney movie, perfect.
I mean, I've definitely shown my friends some of the opera that I like, and even they're always kind of like, it's not my thing. I can't take it seriously. So I would probably react the same way. And I sing it, so.
Yeah, precisely. Not taking it seriously, looking at it as a Disney movie, High School Musical, saying bad words. Yeah, because what? It would be so campy if you saw people just getting up and singing to each other out of nowhere. On the other hand, if you go to your friend's house and he explains to you that, well, they're going to recite poetry like the ancient Greeks, and they're going to use these melodies to make you feel the poetry, then what would your reaction be?
Well, I mean, firstly, if I knew what was happening when I went over there and it wasn't just random and like startling, I would, I like stuff like that. Ancient Greek stuff like that is just awesome to me, but I would be more prepared, I guess is a word for it, and willing to go.
Okay, so part of that too is just having the context, right, to make sense of the art that's in front of you. Very true. And that's why we do what we do in this class too, so you guys have that context. I would try to pick apart the relationship between lyrics. Yeah, excellent. Which is a perfect ideal way to approach a piece with which you're unfamiliar, is active listening. And focusing on the relationship between lyrics and music is especially valuable in the Baroque era, because what was Monteverdi's motto? Somebody tell me. Don't make me Dora.
Sorry, one more time.
What was Monteverdi's motto?
Music should
Like
fit
make
the
the words the mistress of the music or something.
Yeah, let the text be mistress of the music. So I see Maya put in the chat, let the music be the mistress. It's actually opposite, Maya. You don't want the, yes, very close. You want the words to be in charge. And then the music has to express whatever the words say. So yeah, let the text be mistress of the music. So picking apart the relationship between those two would be an invaluable way of approaching Baroque music for the first time. But yeah, I think so. In short, to bring us all back on the same page, I think the general consensus among a large population would be, if these people just got up on stage and started singing songs to each other, it would probably feel campy because it's so unbelievable. It's so foreign to us. That's not how anybody experiences life. Unfortunately, I think life would be a lot more fun if we all went around singing songs to each other, but we don't. And so that would feel kind of campy. But to get up and recite poetry, well, now that we can dig into. We can align ourselves with that. Does that make sense to everybody? Thumbs or hands? Are we feeling good with that general concept of newness? Okay, good, good, good. So let's keep going. In terms of this structure, yes, early opera was mostly recitative, and don't throw rocks at me, but there were actually two types of recitative that you have to know. So in addition to knowing the difference between recitative and aria, I need you guys to know the difference between recitativo secco and recitativo accompagnato. So recitativo secco is dry recitativo. Secco literally means dry in Italian. So recitativo secco is dry recitative, and it's unmetered, of course, as all recitate is. And it's just basso continuo accompaniment. And the basso continuo, so like usually a harpsichord, is just interjecting on structurally important pitches. So singer reaches an important word, harpsichordist goes bum. Then singer sings some more alone. They hit another important word, the harpsichordist goes bum, and then this, and so on and so forth. Recitativo accompagnato, on the other hand, has the whole orchestra accompanying the singer. So that orchestra has to flow consistently with the voice and without pausing. And usually this accompaniment would double the voice so that you've got that denser texture, and it seems as if it's just reinforcing the voice rather than overwhelming it. So does everybody in theory understand the difference between secco and accompagnato? I'm going to play you an example in a second, but how
that would be more like specifically some maybe like Handel stuff, like in Messiah.
Yeah, keep going, John. Elaborate on that.
Like for instance, I've sung "Thou Shalt Break Them" from Handel's Messiah, and that is a full-on orchestra accompaniment to it, and that's what I was wondering, like stuff like that. Is that what you're meaning?
Totally, yes. That would be an example of recitativo accompagnato. And now, in fact, so we're talking about early Baroque opera in this particular part, but by the time Handel was doing his thing, recitativo accompagnato was far more like prestigious. It was taken more seriously than recitativo.
Definitely. I got that. I wanted to make sure that it's a completely different time period, but I thought that was the same thing. I just wanted to make sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, by the time Handel was composing, yeah, recitativo accompagnato was like the gold standard. Good. So does everybody feel comfortable in theory with the difference between secco and accompagnato? John is a big fan. Good. Okay, so let me play you this example, and this is all from another early Baroque opera. Oh, damn, you're gonna fight me again? Okay. You do want to? Oh. Okay. Well, that didn't work. But if you listen to L'Incoronazione di Poppea, which we are going to as part of our excerpts, you will hear different examples of secco versus accompagnato. Whenever you hear just a basso continuo, it's secco. When you hear a whole orchestra, it's accompagnato. But now that we understand the structure of these early operas, let's take a peek at the example par excellence, which is Claudio Monteverdi's Orfeo. So 1607, you can see this is really early in the Baroque era. If the Baroque era we consider as starting in 1600, then this is really early in that time period. And notice this is really close on the heels of la musica sopra Euridice, why can't I talk today? That Peri and Caccini composed and that we talked about last time. So this Orpheus myth is hovering over the Baroque era. And in fact, it still hovers over us because, like I said, last time we have Hadestown. Mark O'Coin is just about to premiere a new opera version of Eurydice. So yeah, this myth still hovers over us, and we can see how present it is in the cultural consciousness. So this was composed not in Florence, but in Mantua for the court of the Duke of Gonzaga. And this was for a specific group of intellectual noblemen called the Accademia degli Inveghiti, the Academy of the unseen, the think of them as renegades, basically the Academy of the Renegades. So just like we talked about the Camerata in Florence last time, this is another academy in Mantua. So this like just group of wealthy people sitting around talking about what art should be. And Claudio Monteverdi writes L'Orfeo for this group. Like I mentioned before, it ends with the Deus Ex Machina, the God in a machine. Apollo comes down, waves his magic Apollo wand, and gives Orpheus a kind of happy ending by turning him into that constellation. Now, what Monteverdi is kind of just figuring out in Orfeo, because this is one of the first operas, is the difference between phenomenal and noumenal music. Now, those are fancy words, and they just mean phenomenal music means music that the characters on stage actually hear, the songs they sing to each other. Noumenal music means music that we, the audience, experiences, but that characters don't experience as music. So, based on what we've already talked about with aria and recit, which do you think would be the phenomenal music, the music that the characters actually hear on stage?
The aria?
Perfect. The arias are the phenomenal music. So that means that the noumenal music would be
Recitativo?
recitativo. Good. So that's the way Monteverdi handles this dramatic issue, is by making the phenomenal music arias and the noumenal music recits. Now, here's what's really awesome about putting shepherds in these early operas. And this is why you see, if you look at any early opera, there are shepherds. Why? Because there is a trope in Renaissance and Baroque art that shepherds are inherently musical. We talked about this with the madrigal and the pastoral subject matter, the idea that these shepherds are just out in the field singing all day. So, naturally, it makes it easier on the composer if they can put shepherds into the plot, because the shepherds give them an excuse to sing. The shepherds give them an excuse for phenomenal music. So, what we hear in Act 2, this is the part of the opera where Orpheus and Eurydice have just been married. They've just celebrated their wedding. And Orpheus is getting down with all the guys. They're having their party, when a messenger comes in and tells them that, hey, sorry to harsh your groove, but while you guys were out here partying, Eurydice got bit by a snake and now she's dead. Okay, thanks, bye. And then Orpheus mourns. So that's Act 2, and that's the part that we're popping in on in this opera. And the big section of this, the overwhelming majority of this scene, is the canzonetta that Orpheus sings while he's celebrating. So a canzonetta is a strophic aria. Somebody remind me what strophic means.
Does it mean like there are like stanzas and like meter and rhymed couplet and all that stuff that's associated with poetry?
Stanzas, meters, rhymes, absolutely. Doesn't necessarily have to be in couplets though. So absolutely, we've just got those stanzas, those verses that the music repeats over and over again. We have the chunk of music that keeps coming back. It's just got new words each time. Those are our verses, our stanzas. And yes, rhymed poetry. So versi lirici here. So this is a strophic aria. And each strophe, each verse, each stanza is framed by what we call a ritornello. In other words, an instrumental section that the orchestra plays each time. So just like the verse is a chunk of music that keeps coming back, each stanza is separated by a little instrumental chunk that keeps coming back. And we're going to hear that in just a second. So before I play, any questions about Orpheus? Okay. So I am going to play the canzonetta, and okay, no, I'm sorry. I am going to play the portion where the messenger comes in. So let's hear that, the canzonetta into the messenger. Okay, here's our canzonetta first, and then we'll transition into the messenger. And what I want you to think about as we're listening to this canzonetta is, how does Monteverdi convey celebration to us? How does he make this scene believable? Or does he not make it believable? I don't know. Maybe you have an entirely different reaction. But how does he make this believable or not?
De mi lunga aspri tormenti, quando i sassi a me lamenti, risponde al fatti pietosi. Ti ricorda, o boschi ombrosi, ti ricorda, o boschi ombrosi. Dite allor non vi sembrai più d'ogni altro sconsolato, or fortuna istil cangiato, ed avvolto in festa i guai. Dite allor non vi sembrai più d'ogni altro sconsolato.
Okay, so we've heard a couple stanzas and a couple ritornellos. How does Monteverdi make that believable to us?
So was that aria or recitative?
That was aria. That was the canzonetta with the
Okay.
rhymed poetry. Yeah, absolutely.
Gotcha.
So remember, this aria is the part that is song-y. It's the part that might come across as a little campy if we're not used to people singing to each other. So how do we overcome that camp here? Or don't we?
I don't know. I think the hemiola is kind of like hard to overcome because it's like that, like not having a consistent like emphasis like throughout the entire thing. I mean, it's a consistent pattern, but like if one part is in 2 and then the next part is in 3, like that's kind of like, people don't really talk that way. So I don't know. I think that would be the hardest part to overcome.
Let's focus in on that for a minute. Good. Okay, so we do have, like you said, a repeating pattern. And hey, it worked for Bernstein. I like to be in America. Right? Okay. So if it worked for Bernstein and West Side Story, there must be something here we can latch on to. Anybody
Maybe
else?
I'll like halfway take that back because like maybe the language that they use, like the emphasis for like certain words match up with the 3-4 feeling parts, and then like other parts of the language like match up with the 6-8. So that might make it feel more natural.
Absolutely. So poetic meter will, that's a huge part of the composer's job, is to match the lyrical meter. So they have to make the words sit naturally in the rhythm of the music. They have to make the rhythm of speech fit with the rhythm of the music. And so, yeah, that's where the poet, the librettist, and the composer have to be like really in tune with each other. Good. And that, yeah. So that rhythm might not feel entirely natural because it is so, it alternates so frequently. But it works with the speech, if that makes sense. Yeah. Good. What other reaction? I should be hearing a multiplicity of voices. You all are intelligent people with big brains. So what are you thinking about this music? Let me get my Pink Floyd on. Hello, is anybody out there? Okay, for the sake of time, let's keep going. So what were the subjects of these earliest operas? Well, ancient myths, and of course, for the obvious reasons of looking back to ancient Greco-Roman models. So they're getting inspired by the things that the ancient Greco-Romans talked about. But there's also this idea of mythology and poetry going together. So these myths fit into libretti really well. It seemed natural to the Baroque audience that these myths, these mythological characters, would speak in poetry. Likewise, again, all of the shepherds in ancient Greco-Roman mythology. We saw them in chansons. We saw them in madrigals. This is a thing that keeps coming back throughout the centuries. Shepherds sing. And there are a lot of shepherds in ancient myths. So totally natural association. Other kinds of subjects you will hear is that these stories of ancient kings and warriors. And that's because these kings and warriors are symbols of contemporary potentates who had commissioned and hosted the operas. So the characters, these ancient heroes and royalty, were chosen specifically to represent some desirable attribute of the ruler who paid for the opera. The stories were chosen to reflect current events facing the king and the nobility. And of course, the commonality between ancient myths and ancient kings and heroes is that the people on stage are not like us. For this singing to be plausible, we can't have common everyday Joe Schmo up on the stage. It would be campy. We need to have supernatural beings, extraordinary beings, people who are not mere mortals like we are. Now, as I've said a few times already, this stuff starts out as a courtly genre. In other words, it's paid for, it's hosted by, it takes place in the homes of nobles. And it's specifically sponsored to glorify these noble families. As I just mentioned, these operas also often represented like a specific member of the family, or the plot was chosen as part of a celebration, like a wedding that they had. And invitations to these things, again, as I mentioned before, were status symbols. This is art only for the rich and famous. Incidentally, think about it. Like if you're in their home, this is a day before electric lighting. So the halls that these operas would be performed in were just lit by tons of candles. You can't dim candles. You can't shut them off and turn them back on like you can the lights of a modern theater. So when you go to an opera, you are there to be seen as well as to be in the audience. Everybody during the opera would be looking around to see who else got an invitation. Ooh, I didn't know that Mrs. Jones was fighting with Mrs. Smith. I guess that's why she's not here. Oh, look, those two just had a fight, but look, they must have gotten back together. It's total Vanity Fair. It's the cover story of the latest People or US Weekly that's going on in courtly opera. But opera doesn't stay in the courts, because what happens is these things get too expensive for any one person to host. If opera is all about grand spectacle, if opera is all about outspending the people next to you, it's not sustainable, right? Nobody has that much money that they can just repeatedly put these things on. So in Venice, they came up with a new system. There would be a public opera hall for the very first time, an opera hall that you could buy tickets to. Anybody with enough money could purchase a ticket and experience this opera. So the opera hall was headed by a specific type of businessman called an impresario. And we still have impresarios today. We have Peter Gelb, heaven help us. We have the people running any opera house in the world. Those are businessmen and women, of course. And this is a type of entrepreneur who organizes and schedules an entire opera season. They are a representative of the stakeholders, the shareholders, the investors in that opera hall. And then they take a percentage of sales. So the impresario was hired by rich people to run an opera hall because the cost of court operas got out of hand. And the nobles didn't want to finance the ventures themselves. So noble investors would own the box seats of an opera hall. That's why even now the box seats are the fancy place to be, because that meant you were a stakeholder, a shareholder in the hall. But the impresario would sell tickets to the rest. And the impresario was under contract to provide a specific number and type of operas for a given season. And they even had restrictions around who to hire. So the impresario would say, like, I want to hire singer A because I think they'd be perfect for this role. And they would have to negotiate with the noble investors who wanted a different singer in that role. But long story short, the impresario was a business person whose sole job was to oversee daily operations at the opera hall. And in return, they would get paid by the nobles, and they would get a percentage of ticket sales. Does that business model make sense to everybody? Do we understand public opera in the Baroque era? Does anybody have questions, thumbs or hands? I see a few thumbs. Okay, for the sake of time, let's keep going because I don't see any hands. The first public opera hall still exists. It is the Teatro San Cassiano that was opened in 1637. And again, financed by ticket sales. So check it out. This thing is still around. It was built very shortly after the inception of opera, but you can still go there today and hear some Monteverdi. Another business model that we want to be aware of is that of the Fabi Armonici. The Fabi Armonici literally means musicians of Apollo or Phoebus. So Fabi, Phoebus, Armonici, musicians. Fabi Armonici, Phoebus's musicians. Cool, cool. So these Fabi Armonici were touring groups of performers who would sing, and they would finance themselves purely through ticket sales. So they began touring Italy around 1644, and they explored this business model of supporting themselves by selling tickets. And within just a few years, we had like several troops of Fabi Armonici touring Italy and even taking that business model abroad to other countries, which we're going to see very shortly. So does everybody understand who the Fabi Armonici were? Thumbs or hands? Good. Okay, I don't see any hands, so I'm going to keep going.
So would they rent out like these public opera houses and then like have their and then like go around the country or whatever and like what's the word I'm looking for? Like use these opera houses as a venue for whatever they're doing and like traveling around to different opera houses, or was it just kind of like something else?
No, that's an excellent question. They wouldn't be performing in the public opera houses because they weren't resident there. They weren't part of that company. What they would do is they would actually find any space they possibly could in whatever city they were in. So whether it was a public market, they might be performing like we have farmers markets today. They might just get up on a bunch of tables and put on their performance there. They might rent out a local building that they feel has enough space. It depended on what city they were in, but they wouldn't be in the opera halls because they weren't part of that company. Does that make sense? Good question. So as opera gets more and more entrenched in the cultural system, we start to see different kinds of opera. We start to see opera seria, which, as you can tell from the name, means serious opera. So we're talking tragedies, and opera buffa, comedic opera, like a buffoon. So buffoon, opera buffa is funny, seria, serious, tragic, tragic, comic, tragic, comic. Everybody feel okay with the difference between opera seria and opera buffa so far? Like we understand that those terms, what they mean. Good. Okay, so let's get into the actual differences between these two types of operas. So opera seria was the more prestigious of the two. It was the more respected. And it was called Neapolitan opera because supposedly in Naples, well, not supposedly, really, in Naples, we start to see these tragedies take hold and become firmly entrenched. And by the late 1600s, so we started in the early 1600s. By the late 1600s, not late, mid 1600s, we are in what we call the first bel canto. So we're used to thinking of bel canto as Rossini, Bellini, and Donizetti, right? From the 1800s. Well, about 200 years before, in the mid 1600s, we have the first bel canto, which is similarly an emphasis on sweet, virtuosic melody. It's on vocal prowess. And because that emphasis falls on the voice, we call the mid 1600s in Italy the first bel canto. Now, the form that opera seria arias took was da capo form. Now, y'all are experienced musicians. You all know that da capo means from the head or from the top. And the reason that these were called da capo arias is because they are in a very rigid form where you've got an A section, then a B section. And at the end of the B section, the composer would simply write da capo. And the singer has to go back and sing the A section again. So you get an A, B, A form. Da capo arias are in ternary form, A, B, A. So the thing I need y'all to know is that opera seria used da capo arias, and da capo arias are A, B, A. Do we all feel good about that? Thumbs, hands, thumbs, hands. Solid. Okay. Also, there's a predominance of high voices in the lead role. So not only sopranos, but yes, castrati. And the poet par excellence who standardizes the libretti of opera seria was a guy named Pietro Metastasio. He wrote the most important libretti of the most important opera seria libretti of the 17th century. And he wrote important treatises about the way poets should work. So not only did he write the most important poems, he wrote books teaching others how to do the same. So he was both practitioner and theorist. These opera seria are all about those ancient heroes and kings and myths that we talked about, because it's all tragedy. That's what makes it opera seria, is the fact that it's serious, tragic. And the perfect example of opera seria is another one by my good friend Claudio, L'Incoronazione di Poppea. So the coronation of Poppea from 1643. This is part of that first bel canto period. This is one of those opera seria. So this is Monteverdi's final opera. We listened to Orfeo, his very first one. Now we're going to hear Poppea, his very last one. And as opposed to Mantua, where Orfeo was written for a private courtly audience, now we see Poppea being written for a public theater in Venice. And why is this so suited for that public theater in Venice? Because Venice was famous for its libertinism. In other words, licentiousness, let's say, if we want to be delicate. Bad behavior, if we're being straightforward. So Venice was known for all kinds of bad behavior, specifically another club, another academy called the Accademia degli Incogniti, the Academy of the Unknown, because they would hide their actions. They had to do all these things in the dark secretly. So they were the Academy of the Unknown. And this opera, this Poppea, is all about licentiousness and libertinism. We're talking about Nero, right? The guy who fiddled while Rome burned and was a walking incarnation of everything you shouldn't do. So that's why this opera played so well in Venice. Of course, it takes place in ancient Rome and relies on the historical narrative of Nero and his second wife, Poppea. So this is the story of basically Poppea seducing Nero. What's interesting about it is, even though it is firmly an opera seria, it is like firmly serious. We know it's high stakes, it's political drama. We see this weird blend of buffa characters along with the seria characters. So the castrati would be taken very seriously. The castrati are the heroes. They're the ones that everybody's swooning over. On the other hand, we have a cross-dressing role where the maid is played by a bass, a man in drag. So she's meant to be, he in women's clothing is meant to be laughed at. So there's this like weird mix of the nobles and the comedic servants. And this opera is all about excess because it's about Nero. So Monteverdi does everything over the top in this opera, including madrigalisms. Remember, madrigalisms are text painting. And the perfect example of this is Seneca's music. So Seneca is the advisor who is supposed to be steering Nero. Seneca is supposed to be the wise man at the helm behind Nero's youthful indiscretion. But because Seneca gets lost in his own melodies, we see the wise advisor turning into this like self-indulgent, kind of a libertine of a different sort, because he's taking pleasure in his own voice as opposed to some of the more salacious things. So let's listen to a little bit of Poppea. And the question, oh no, cooperate with me. Okay. The question that I want you to meditate on as we listen to Poppea is, what feels excessive about this opera? What feels over the top?
La sconsolata donna assunta all'impero per patire il servaggio. Gloriosa del mondo imperatrice, sovra i titoli eccelsi degli insigni avitui, conspicua e grande, la vanità del pianto degli occhi imperiali e ufficio indegno. Ringrazia la fortuna che con i colpi suoi t'accresce gli ornamenti, la corte non percossa, non può mandar a
Okay. What felt excessive about that to you guys?
Definitely the last syllable when he was moving all over the place on the same syllable of the word, but very like, is melismatic the right word to use there?
100.
Yeah. So yeah, just kind of that is just kind of like, okay.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. For all of our blathering before about natural text setting, that's not natural. Who in their right mind would enunciate that way? So Monteverdi, through that one syllable, is hammering home the idea that Seneca has lost himself. Excellent. What led up to that? Oh, you're all disappearing one by one. Oh, I still have 1 minute. Oh no, I don't. It just turned. Okay. Well, I will say this. Look at the pace, what we call the syllabic density of that recitative. We've got the recit starts out like very slow and well paced, and then it gets faster and faster and faster and picks up, and then we get to that big old melisma at the end. Absolutely. So it's just a constant building in terms of speed, the number of syllables that Seneca is spitting out at you, and crescendoing up to that lovely cascade at the end. Okay, so we'll pick up with just the slight differences with, well, not slight, major differences with Opera Buffa next time. And do I have any questions before we adjourn for today?
I don't have a question, but I'd like to shamelessly plug the opera that's happening tomorrow and Saturday.
Yeah. What's going on?
It's La Finta Giardiniera by Mozart. My cast is tomorrow at 7:30 and Miller, and then the Saturday cast is at 7:30 on Saturday.
Oh, fantastic. Are they streaming it?
No, but you can get tickets at the box office or online. Student tickets
Okay.
are like $10 and you get a comp ticket with your ID.
I mean, I would love to. I live in Ohio, but I would dearly love to. So if they were streaming it, I would totally try to get there.
You know, you'd think they would, given the circumstances.
Yeah. Well, toy.
Thank you very much. Just wanted to add that.
Yeah, thank you. If y'all, unless you're already in it, yeah, please go and see, because that's an amazing opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Addison.